This video is sponsored by Artlist and Artgrid. If you want good royalty-free music and video footage, check out the link down below for a special offer. Recently, I've been playing a little game called Elden Ring, and when I say this, I mean that I played over 100 hours of it. This is the brand new game from the creators of Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and for this one, they teamed up with the author of Game of Thrones to create the game's world and lore. It follows the same overall formula and design philosophies as their previous work, but this time set in a huge open world setting. And if you've been living under a rock, you might not be aware that this game took the world by storm. In less than a month, it sold more than 12 million copies, making it From Software's best-selling title by far. Not only that, but it also received overwhelming critical acclaim, with many reviewers giving it the almighty perfect score. Critics praised the game's combat, build diversity, and the classic level design of the legacy dungeons, but if there's one thing critics were absolutely unanimous about, was the open world itself. Many called it one of the best in decades and one of the greatest examples of what open-world adventures should be like. They found it refreshing, surprising, and masterfully crafted. But it also happens to be incredibly huge. In fact, it's probably my longest single playthrough ever since The Witcher 3. What's interesting about Elden Ring though is that when you first boot up the game and have no knowledge whatsoever about the size of its world, it's not immediately obvious that you're about to go on a journey of biblical proportions. It doesn't have the sprawling cities of Assassin's Creed or the bustling towns and villages of Skyrim. Elden Ring actually looks kind of empty and dead for the most part, even in its biggest regions. Obviously, if you've played the game, you know very well that it's far from being empty, but it does feel empty in my opinion. It feels desolate and abandoned. You never experience the same overwhelming sensation that comes when you open up the map in many Ubisoft open world and see a disgusting amount of icons. And that's truly Elden Ring's biggest strength. Most modern open world games tend to make a promise to the players right from the get-go, and that promise is content. A lot of times games will be very aggressive about it, as if developers wanted you to feel like you got your money's worth in the first few minutes. They will drop dozens of side quests on you, they will put map markers everywhere, they will have checklists of all the collectibles you can get, and they will give you very specific objectives to complete to make sure that you always have something to do. These games are terrified of boredom, but the funny thing is that this never-ending desire to keep the player entertained can lead to the exact opposite. When you have a laundry list of things to do and a bunch of map markers to guide you around, you end up not exploring the world but merely traversing it, mindlessly going from point A to point B while collecting every shiny collectible you see only to get the platinum trophy. These games end up feeling like chores more than anything else. But Elden Ring doesn't suffer from any of that, and it's mainly because of its devotion to hiding everything from the player. When you open up your map, it's empty. No markers to tell you where to go and no objectives to tell you what is the point of all this. You open up your menu, it's empty as well. Aside from your gear and your stats, there's no quest log and there's nothing to keep track of your progress aside from trophies. Even when you set foot in the lands between for the first time, it looks surprisingly empty. Everywhere you look is like these huge chunks of barren landscapes with landmarks far away in the distance. You get an incredible sense of freedom, but it can also be very confusing when you start playing, and my first hour with Elden Ring wasn't the best. Initially, after completing the opening area, I decided to follow the main road. I tried fighting the tree sentinel and got destroyed in mere seconds, so I decided to move on. I found a church, talked to a merchant, and followed the path leading to a small forest nearby. I sneaked past a couple of soldiers and found the gatefront ruins where multiple enemies were waiting for me. I killed every single last one of them, went down this cellar, and picked up a few items. I decided to rest at a nearby site of grace and receive a visit from Melina, who gave me a horse to travel around more quickly. Then I continued my journey. I went down south, crossed a few patrols, found another ruin, another cellar, and another enemy camp. At this point, I was very underwhelmed because I thought that, much like most open world games, this would be the core of the gameplay loop. I was like, is this really all there is to it? Enemy camps and ruins? Am I missing something? I knew there would be legacy dungeons later on, but I was having a very hard time understanding the perfect scores and the praise the open world was receiving. Initially, Elden Ring seemed so far away from epic RPGs like The Witcher or Skyrim. In fact, on the surface, it reminded me a lot more of Shadow of the Colossus. Let me explain. This game follows a philosophy called design by subtraction, which is the idea of stripping away everything that doesn't add anything to the intended experience. This can mean getting rid of pointless mechanics or straight up removing UI elements. Of course, Shadow of the Colossus takes it to the extreme by having no content aside from boss fights and minor collectibles, but what you get is a very pure adventure that fully embraces emptiness. But the beauty in this game is that the empty space in between the content is just as important as the content itself. That's how you get atmosphere and world building. And that minimalistic approach can also be found in the way it communicates information to the player. Similar to Elden Ring, this game is incredibly vague and cryptic in everything it does, from gameplay to story. For example, the map doesn't really tell you anything, and the only way to find your objective is by pulling out your sword and letting sunlight reflect on it, which only gives you a vague idea of where to go next. And because of that, you need to study how the world is built. One thing that happens when you're not given a detailed overview of a game world is that you need to explore much more carefully, and your own curiosity is the only motivator for any discovery you make. And Elden Ring is very similar in that regard, so much so that everything I said about Shadow of the Colossus can also be said about Elden Ring. Vague, cryptic, no pointless mechanics, minimal navigational clues, and a clever use of empty space. But there's one major difference. Unlike Shadow of the Colossus, Elden Ring hides a staggering amount of content underneath its apparent emptiness. If I had to summarize what this game feels like, I'd say it's basically just randomly finding interesting stuff for 100 hours. It pretends to be empty and then it goes, psych, here's a 2-hour-long dungeon. When you start going off the beaten path, you'll discover castles, underground tunnels, complex cave systems, and sometimes you'll find new locations the size of an entire Dark Souls area. It's absolutely insane. And finding all of these things by yourself feels incredible, a feeling that would not have been the same if the game wasn't as secretive about its content. From Software could have been unbelievably pretentious about the size of their game. I mean, there's like 300 weapons and 150 boss fights. What's even crazier is that most of them are optional and some of them are incredibly easy to miss. And the same thing can be said about pretty much anything in this game. Honestly, the developers could have placed an absurd amount of markers on the map if they wanted to, but they didn't. They understand that a surprise only works when you're not expecting it, and it's because the game looks almost devoid of content from a distance that it manages to surprise you constantly, which makes exploration incredibly fun, rewarding, and most importantly, engaging. Even the most mundane stuff is more interesting in Elden Ring because of that approach. Just take Selene, for example. She's the first spell vendor you will most likely come across. In other games, you would have an icon on the map telling you that you can buy spells by talking to her in this specific location. But in Elden Ring, she's hiding behind a completely optional boss underneath a random set of ruins. Which is just insane because Selene is a big deal. She sells some really good spells, she has an entire quest line, and she can even be summoned during one of the boss fights. Yet, she's treated as a completely missable character. So when you find her, it actually feels like you've achieved something, which is very uncommon with NPCs in open worlds, especially vendors. Of course, the map plays a huge role in all of this. When you start the game, you actually don't have a map. You need to find map fragments, but even when you find one, you still have work to do. Since there are no points of interest, you must read the map, try to study its topography, and identify potential structures to explore. The map is informative, but it doesn't explicitly reveal content to the player. What I also love is the fact that it doesn't spoil the size of the world. It starts very small and gradually expands as you progress in the game. And every time you find a new fragment, you get a little holy shit moment because the game keeps on growing. And that's the beauty of having an empty map. It makes players much more involved. In my opinion, one of the worst things that can happen in a video game is players turning their brains off because of developers making everything so freaking obvious, leaving no place for mystery whatsoever. But that never happens in Elden Ring, and that's only because From Software believes in the player's ability to figure stuff out on their own and uncover every piece of content without any guidance. The only form of guidance you'll get is by going to wikis and talking to people on Reddit, but even then, you're actually doing something and not just blindly following map markers. And what's funny about everything I just described surrounding Elden Ring's brilliant open world structure is the fact that, I believe, From Software manages to get away with a lot of modern tropes people are sick and tired of, more than you might have realized. There are enemy camps to clear out, there's trailing missions where you follow ghosts to specific locations, there are many fetch quests, and there's also quite a lot of repeated content with the Everjails or the Mage Towers. But Elden Ring makes all of these so much more tolerable thanks to the fact that they don't appear on the map, they're not part of a checklist, and they're also not overly drawn out, unlike some games with 15-minute long trailing missions constantly interrupted by the character talking to themselves. Fetch quests are also actually fun because they require research instead of being told exactly where to find what you're looking for. When Raya asks you to find a necklace someone stole from her, the only information you get is to look out for an abandoned house. So when you find the house, kill the thief, and retrieve the necklace, it feels rewarding because you did all of this by yourself. Of course, on top of all these tropes, Elden Ring has an insane amount of variety, surprises, and quality handcrafted content to balance things out, but still, I think it shows that the problem with a lot of modern open world games maybe isn't the content itself, but how it's presented to the player. Elden Ring is the perfect example of what happens when developers stop holding the player by the hand. Instead of giving them a map filled with markers, give them a blank slate and let them fill it out by themselves as they play the game. It's just more fun when you approach an open world without knowing what to expect. Don't be afraid of emptiness, confusion, and questions, because those make for interesting and thought-provoking gameplay experiences. I truly believe that every single studio can learn something from this game. Yes, Elden Ring goes a little bit too far sometimes by having quests that are almost impossible to complete without going to the wiki, but it should at the very least inspire developers to make more compelling open worlds without necessarily being as obscure as Elden Ring. For instance, you can remove explicit map markers and still have a checklist of things to complete, or you can have a quest log and not reveal the exact location of the objectives. No matter what, there are many lessons to be learned from Elden Ring, and I think it's safe to say that From Software's latest masterpiece will influence gaming for years to come. Thank you so much for watching this video. I can't believe we finally got to play Elden Ring. I had such a fun time with it. Unfortunately, it kind of ruined a lot of stuff for me because of how good it was, but hopefully God of War Ragnarok and Hogwarts Legacy won't let me down. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can also follow me on Twitter for more. That's pretty much it, and I'll see you guys later.